The Winchester scope caught the last light of day, casting a red glint across the barrel. Mason Hudson's finger rested lightly on the trigger, his breath steady as the Arizona wind swept dust across the empty plain. Buzzards circled overhead, as if knowing death was near. There was a time when holding this rifle felt as natural as breathing. Now it felt like betrayal, a broken promise. If you swore never to hold a gun again, what would make you break that vow? For Mason Hudson, the answer lay in the eyes of the woman kneeling before his ranch gate, begging him for a quick death. Her white shirt was torn and bloodied. Her bare feet had left a trail of crimson prints in the dust. Her blonde hair hung in matted tangles around a face marked with bruises and desperation. She couldn't have been more than 24. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry leather. "Just make it quick." Mason lowered his rifle, the woman's words hitting him harder than any bullet ever could. She thought he was there to kill her. She was hoping he would. The year was 1885, and Mason Hudson had been the most feared lawman in Arizona territory for over a decade. At 40, he'd put more outlaws in the ground than most men had shaken hands. His reputation stretched from Tombstone to Prescott, the sheriff who never missed. Hudson doesn't draw unless he intends to fire, folks would say, and he doesn't fire unless he intends to kill. Mason had once cornered 3 Dalton boys in a saloon in Yuma. They'd drawn first. All 3 were dead before their guns cleared leather. The newspaper called it the fastest display of gunmanship ever witnessed west of the Mississippi. But that was before Victor Blackwood came to his town, before the night that turned the lawman into a ghost. Blackwood ran the largest human trafficking operation west of the Mississippi. He specialized in selling young women to mining camps and frontier towns where women were scarce. Mason had tracked him for months, gathering evidence, building a case. "I'll get him legally," Mason had promised his wife, Catherine. "No gunfights, no blood. I want this one by the book." Catherine had smiled, relief in her eyes. She worried each time he strapped on his guns. Their daughter, Emily, barely 6, had never known a day when her father wasn't the sheriff. "I want him in a courtroom," Mason told his deputy that night. "Not in a pine box." But Blackwood had informants everywhere. He knew Mason was closing in, so he struck first. Mason was interviewing a witness when the shots rang out at his home. By the time he reached his small house on the edge of town, the flames had already consumed half the structure. Catherine had been shot twice in the chest. Emily, Mason still couldn't bear to remember how he found his daughter. He could still hear Catherine's final words, whispered as he cradled her. "Promise me, no more killing." The doctor later said Mason had stood in the street for hours, holding their bodies, refusing to let them go. 3 days later, he pinned his badge to his daughter's small coffin and buried it with her. He rode out of town that same day, leaving everything behind. No one had seen Sheriff Mason Hudson since, until now. The woman at his gate had collapsed fully into the dust. Her breathing came in ragged gasps. Even from 20 yards away, Mason could see she wouldn't last much longer without help. For 5 years, he lived alone on this ranch, speaking only to his horses and the wind. He wanted no part of other people's troubles, no part of justice or law. But something in her eyes, that same desperation he'd seen in his own reflection for years, made him move. He approached slowly, rifle pointed downward. As he drew closer, he saw the rope burns on her wrists, the methodical pattern of her bruises. These weren't random injuries from a fall or a fight. These were the marks of ownership. Someone had treated her like property. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She flinched when he knelt beside her, her eyes, pale blue and clouded with pain, fixed on his face. "My name is Mason Hudson," he said. "This is my ranch. You're safe here." A bitter smile crossed her cracked lips. "No one's safe anywhere," she whispered before consciousness finally slipped away. Mason carried her to the house, her weight barely noticeable against his chest. Years of solitude hadn't softened him. Ranch work had kept his frame as solid as when he'd worn a badge. He laid her on his bed, then retrieved his medical kit, a relic from his lawman days. The knife made quick work of the ropes around her wrists. The wounds beneath were deep, infected. Whoever had tied her hadn't cared if the bindings cut flesh. Mason cleaned each wound with whiskey, his movements precise and efficient. He'd patched up enough bullet holes and knife cuts to work without hesitation. The gash on her hip was the worst, a deep puncture that still seeped blood. He stitched it closed with catgut, his fingers steady. She woke as he was bandaging her shoulder, jerking away with surprising strength. "Easy," he said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm just tending your wounds." Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the sparse furnishings. A bed, a table, a worn cabinet, a bookshelf filled with volumes that seemed out of place in this frontier home. "Who are you?" she demanded, pulling the blanket around herself. "I told you, Mason Hudson. This is my ranch. Are you working for him?" Her voice hardened. "For who?" "Victor Blackwood." The name hit Mason like a physical blow. For 5 years, he'd avoided even thinking it. Now it hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned by this half-dead girl. "I don't work for anyone," he said finally, "least of all Blackwood." Something in his tone made her study him more carefully. "You know him." It wasn't a question. Mason turned away, busying himself with putting away the medical supplies. "I knew him once," he admitted, "a lifetime ago." She watched him, calculation replacing fear in her eyes. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said. "My brother-in-law, Sam, sold me to Blackwood. My own sister Emma stood by and let it happen." Mason handed her a cup of water. She drank it greedily. "Sam told me there was honest work in Silver City," she said, her voice hollow. "It was all lies. They needed money, and I was what they had to sell. $30, less than a good horse." Something shifted in Mason's chest, a feeling he thought had died with Catherine and Emily. Rage, pure and clean. He walked to the bookshelf, pulled on a volume of Thoreau. The shelf swung outward, revealing a hidden compartment. Sarah gasped as Mason withdrew a polished oak box. He opened it carefully, as if it might contain explosives. Inside lay a silver sheriff's badge, 2 Colt revolvers, and a folded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Sheriff's Family Slaughtered. Blackwood Suspected." "He took my family too," Mason said quietly. "My wife, Catherine. My daughter, Emily. She was 6 years old." His hand traced the worn edge of the badge. "I swore to my dying wife I'd never kill again." Sarah's eyes widened. "You're that Sheriff Hudson? The one who disappeared?" Mason nodded, running his thumb over the tarnished badge. "I swore I'd never wear this again. Never be part of that world." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "But some debts can't remain unpaid forever." For a moment, Mason was back in Silver Springs, watching his house burn, hearing his deputy's voice. "We'll hunt him down, boss. We'll make him pay." And hearing his own reply, "No, we do this legally or not at all." How young and foolish he'd been. "What are you saying?" Sarah asked, pulling him back to the present. "I'm saying Victor Blackwood is going to come looking for you. Men like him don't let property escape." He spat the last word. "And when he does, I'll be waiting." "You'll be killed," she said. "He travels with at least 7 men, all armed." A cold smile touched Mason's lips. "Miss Mitchell, there was a time when the mention of my name made outlaws change their travel plans. I may have been hiding for 5 years, but I haven't forgotten how to shoot." He checked the action on one of the Colts, the mechanism as smooth as the day he'd set it aside. "I'm not going back to being a lawman," he said, "but I will do what needs to be done to end this." Sarah watched him, hope and doubt battling in her eyes. "Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Mason holstered the Colt. the familiar weight of it awakening memories he tried to bury. Because 5 years ago, I couldn't save two people who meant everything to me. Maybe saving you is the closest thing to redemption I'll ever find. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Arizona high country. Mason stood on his porch, surveying his land with new eyes. For years it had been his refuge. Now it would become a battlefield. "We have three advantages," he told Sarah over breakfast. "We know they're coming. We choose the ground. And they don't know who they're facing." She looked better this morning. Color had returned to her cheeks. The simple act of washing and changing into clean clothes, an old shirt of Mason's, had restored some of her dignity. "Tell me about Blackwood's men," Mason said, spreading a rough map of his ranch across the table. 7 men, last I counted, all killers. Sam, my brother-in-law, isn't much with a gun, but he's mean. Then there's Lyle, who handles the women. He's the one who did this." She gestured to her bruised face. Mason made notes on the map. "Weapons? Shotguns, revolvers. Blackwood carries a silver Remington. He's proud of it. Says he took it off a Texas Ranger he killed." Mason's jaw tightened. "Charlie Dawson," he muttered. "Good man. Deserved better than Blackwood's bullet." He outlined his plan. The ranch had natural advantages. A long approach through open country, a creek to the east, rocky outcroppings perfect for cover. He'd position his most valuable horses, including 2 rare Appaloosas, prominently in the corral. "Bait?" Sarah asked. Mason nodded. "Blackwood can't resist fine horseflesh. He'll want those mares almost as much as he wants you back." He rode into town that afternoon, leaving Sarah with a loaded shotgun and strict instructions to stay hidden. Holston's settlement wasn't much. A general store, a saloon, a small doctor's office. But it had a telegraph. The telegrapher's eyes widened when Mason stated his business. "A wire to Territorial Governor Thompson himself?" "That's right. Tell him it's from Mason Hudson." The man's jaw slackened. "Sheriff Hudson? But you're... Folks thought you were dead." "Just write the message." When he returned, Mason brought supplies: ammunition, dynamite from the mining supply, and food. He also brought Dr. William Peters, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and steady hands. "The doc's going to document your injuries," Mason explained to Sarah. "We need evidence if we're going to bring legal charges." "Legal charges?" Sarah looked bewildered. "I thought you were planning to kill them all." Dr. Peters cleared his throat uncomfortably. "That would be simpler," Mason admitted. "But it wouldn't be justice. Real justice happens in a courtroom." While the doctor examined Sarah, Mason set to work. He positioned rifles at strategic points around the property. He prepared dynamite charges along the main approach. He even retrieved an old Gatling gun, a souvenir from his lawman days, and mounted it in the barn loft. By nightfall, the ranch had been transformed into a fortress. Dr. Peters departed with his documentation and a message: "Stay in town until it was over." That evening, Mason taught Sarah to shoot his spare Colt. Her hands were steady as she aimed at bottles he'd set up 50 yards out. "I never shot anything before," she admitted after missing for the 10th time. "Most people who pick up guns shouldn't," Mason replied. "But sometimes there's no choice." He adjusted her grip. "Squeeze, don't pull." The bottle shattered on her next shot. The smile that lit her face made her look younger, reminded Mason of the girl she must have been before Blackwood. "You're a natural," Mason observed as Sarah hit another bottle. "Ever handled anything bigger than a handgun?" When she shook her head, he led her to the barn where the Gatling gun sat covered under a tarp. "This old girl saved my life more than once. Tomorrow she might save yours too." Sarah ran her fingers over the crank mechanism, a determined glint in her eyes. "Show me how it works." As dusk fell, a single rider approached from the south. Mason motioned Sarah inside, rifle ready. The stranger stopped 50 yards out, hands visible. You Hudson? He called. Got a message from Blackwood. Says to tell you he knows she's here. Says to enjoy your last night alive. Before Mason could respond, the rider wheeled his horse and galloped away. Sarah's face had gone pale. They found us. Mason checked his Colt. Good. Saves us the trouble of waiting. After dinner, Mason cleaned his weapons on the porch while Sarah watched from the doorway. The familiar ritual of oiling leather and polishing metal brought him back to nights on the sheriff's office porch, keeping watch over the town. Your wife, Sarah said suddenly. What was she like? Mason's hands stilled. No one had asked him about Catherine in years. Strong, he said finally. Stubborn. Believed in me more than I deserved. He smiled faintly. She could shoot better than me, truth be told. Just never let anyone know it. And your daughter? Emily had her mother's eyes, my temper. He holstered the Colt. She wanted to be a doctor, used to bandage up her dolls, said she was going to fix people when she grew up. The silence stretched between them, filled with ghosts. Will the governor really send help? Sarah asked. Frank Thompson and I rode together before he went into politics. He owes me. Mason looked toward the horizon. But they might not get here in time. We need to be ready to stand alone. The note from Thompson was brief. Help coming, 12 Rangers, arriving by noon tomorrow. Mason folded the paper carefully. We need to hold them off until midday, he told Sarah. Think you can manage that? She squared her shoulders. After what they did to me, I could hold them off for a week. That night, neither slept much. They sat together in the main room, watching the darkness through the windows, listening to the night sounds of the desert. What will you do? Sarah asked. After this is over? Mason had been asking himself the same question. 5 years ago, he'd been certain his life was finished. Now he wasn't so sure. One day at a time, he said finally. That's all any of us get. They came at dawn. Mason spotted them through his spyglass. 8 riders moving across the plain toward his ranch. At their head rode a tall man on a black stallion. Even at this distance, Mason recognized Victor Blackwood's distinctive white hat. They're here, he told Sarah, who was loading spare ammunition into her pockets. Remember the plan. Stay hidden until I signal. She nodded, face pale but determined. Kill the snake, not just the rattle. Exactly, Blackwood is the target. Mason checked his weapons one final time. The rest will scatter without him. He positioned himself on the porch. Rifle within reach but not in hand. Better to look unprepared. Let them get close. The riders approached the main gate, spreading out in a practice formation. Mason recognized the strategy. Standard cavalry approach for uncertain territory. Blackwood had military training, once upon a time. Through his peripheral vision, Mason identified each threat. Blackwood at center, 2 gunmen flanking him, professionals judging by their posture. A nervous-looking man who had to be Sam, Sarah's brother-in-law. A thin woman on a mule, Emma presumably. 3 more rough-looking men bringing up the rear, all armed. That's far enough, Mason called when they were 30 yards out. State your business. Blackwood reined in, studying the ranch house. We're looking for property that belongs to us, he called back. A young woman, blonde, blue eyes, answers to Sarah. No property like that here, Mason replied evenly. Just horses and cattle. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he took in Mason's stance. The worn gun belt, the calm demeanor of a man who'd faced down worse odds. I know you, he said suddenly. Hudson, the sheriff from Silver Springs. A cold smile touched Mason's lips. Not a sheriff anymore. They said you were dead. They said the same about you after our last meeting. Mason's hand drifted closer to his holster. Seems we both disappointed the gossips. Sam pushed his horse forward. We got papers, he shouted, waving a document. She's legally bound to work off her debt, sign the contract herself, A contract signed under duress isn't worth the paper it's written on, Mason replied. Neither is a man who'd sell his own family. Emma flinched at this, her eyes downcast. She hadn't looked directly at the house once, ashamed perhaps to face what she'd done. This doesn't concern you, Hudson, Blackwood said, his voice hardening. Walk away now, we'll forget we saw you. Keep harboring my property, and I'll burn your ranch to the ground. His hand moved to the silver Remington at his hip. Just like I burned your house in Silver Springs. The words hung in the air between them, a confession 5 years in the making. Mason's vision narrowed, blood pounding in his ears. I wondered, he said quietly, if it was you who pulled the trigger, or if you just gave the order. Blackwood smiled, revealing a gold tooth. I always handle important matters personally, Sheriff. Your wife recognized me at the end, called me by name, begged for your daughter's life. Before either man could draw, chaos erupted. Sarah, positioned in the barn loft, pulled the rope that opened the corral gate. 20 horses burst forth, thundering between the ranch house and Blackwood's men. Mason drew and fired in one fluid motion, his first bullet catching one of Blackwood's gunmen in the chest. His second shattered the knee of another. The Gatling gun in the barn opened up, Sarah cranking the handle with unexpected skill, sending a hail of lead across the yard. Blackwood and his remaining men scattered, diving for cover. Sam's horse reared, throwing him to the ground. Emma screamed, falling from her mule in her panic. Mason rolled off the porch as return fire splintered the wood where he'd been standing. He took position behind a water trough, picking his shots carefully. 1, 2, 3. Each bullet found its mark. Shoulders, legs, gun hands. Not killing shots, disabling ones. A bullet grazed Mason's arm, hot pain lancing through his bicep. Another tore through his hat. Blackwood was firing from behind a boulder, the silver Remington flashing in the morning sun. You can't win, Hudson, Blackwood shouted. I've got men in town, more coming. You're alone out here. As if in answer, a new sound echoed across the plain. Hoofbeats, many of them. From the east came riders, at least 20, moving fast. At their head flew the flag of the Arizona Rangers. Seems I've got friends too, Mason called back. Blackwood cursed. Kill him now, he ordered his remaining men. Rush him. 2 gunmen broke cover, charging toward Mason's position. He dropped one with a shot to the thigh. Sarah's Gatling fire cut down the second. And then, amid the gun smoke and chaos, Mason found himself face to face with Victor Blackwood. The trafficker had circled around, using the confusion to close distance. His silver Remington was aimed squarely at Mason's chest. 5 years I've wondered where you disappeared to, Blackwood said. Should have finished the job that night. Mason's Colt had jammed with trail dust. He dropped it, hands raised slightly. You murdered a 6-year-old girl, he said, voice deadly calm. Shot a woman who never harmed anyone. All because I was building a case against you. Business is business, Blackwood replied with a shrug. Nothing personal. This is... Mason lunged faster than Blackwood expected. The silver Remington fired, the bullet grazing Mason's side. But momentum carried him forward, tackling Blackwood to the ground. They rolled in the dust, trading blows. Blackwood was younger, but Mason fought with 5 years of buried rage. A fist to the jaw, an elbow to the ribs. Blackwood's knife flashed, opening a cut along Mason's cheek. Mason caught the knife hand, forcing it back until bones cracked. Blackwood howled, the blade falling from nerveless fingers. Mason struck again and again, each blow punctuated with a word. For my wife, for my daughter. When he finally came to his senses, Mason was straddling Blackwood's chest, the trafficker's own knife pressed against his throat. Blood pounded in Mason's ears. One cut, that's all it would take. One slice to end the man who destroyed everything. Blackwood saw it in his eyes. "Do it," he wheezed through broken teeth. "You know you want to." Mason pressed harder, drawing a thin line of blood. His hand trembled. Catherine's voice seemed to whisper in his ear. "Not like this. Never like this." With supreme effort, Mason stood, dragging Blackwood up by his collar. The Rangers had arrived, surrounding the ranch, taking prisoners. At their head rode Frank Thompson, the territorial governor himself, his gray beard neatly trimmed beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "You took everything from me, Blackwood," Mason said, his voice carrying across the now silent yard. "But you couldn't take who I am. That's the one thing no man can steal from another." He shoved the trafficker toward the Rangers. "Justice," Mason said, "not vengeance." Frank dismounted, approaching Mason with something like awe. "When I got your wire, I could scarcely believe it," he said, clasping Mason's shoulder. 5 years without a word, and suddenly you're back in the thick of it." Mason watched as Rangers handcuffed Blackwood, Sam, and the surviving gunman. "Not back," he corrected. "Just finishing something that should have ended years ago." Sarah emerged from the barn, limping slightly but standing tall. Her eyes found Emma, who sat huddled against a wagon wheel, face streaked with tears. Emma looked up as Sarah approached. "He said he'd kill me if I didn't agree," she pleaded. "He said it was you or me." Sarah's eyes hardened. "And you chose yourself, as would any stranger." "But you weren't a stranger, Emma. You were my sister." "Can you ever forgive me?" Sarah was silent for a long moment. "I won't let hatred chain me any more than their ropes did," she said finally. "But we're not family anymore, Emma. Not after this." Frank Thompson examined the documents and statements gathered by Dr. Peters. Human trafficking, murder, attempted murder of a former lawman. He shook his head. "They'll hang for this, Mason. Every last one of them." "Good." Mason holstered his clean Colt. "The law taking its course. That's all I ever wanted." Frank hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket, a sheriff's badge. "Silver Springs has been without a proper lawman since you left," he said. "They could use someone who knows the job." Mason stared at the badge, memories washing over him. Catherine, Emily, the oath he'd taken, the life he'd once led, the man he'd once been. "Maybe there's still justice needs doing out on this frontier," he said quietly, taking the badge. The following morning, Mason stood before 2 simple graves on a hill behind his ranch. He'd buried Catherine and Emily's belongings here when he'd first arrived, unable to bear keeping them in the house, but unwilling to truly part with them. He placed his old tarnished badge on the smaller grave. "I kept my promise for 5 years," he said to the wind. "Tried to hide from who I was, who I am." He touched the new badge pinned to his vest. "But maybe this is how I honor you both. By being the man you loved, the man who stands between good folks and those who'd harm them." Sarah approached slowly, respectful of his grief. "The Rangers are ready to ride," she said. "Governor Thompson says to tell you they'll escort the prisoners to Phoenix for trial." Mason nodded. "And you? Where will you go now?" "Governor offered me a job at his office in the Capitol. Said I could help identify other girls who've been trafficked." She smiled slightly. "Seems I've got a new purpose, too." Mason looked out over his ranch, the bullet holes in the barn, the trampled earth where the battle had raged. For 5 years, this place had been his refuge, his hiding place. Now it felt like what it truly was, just a stopping point on a longer journey. "I'll keep the ranch," he told Sarah. "But my place is back in Silver Springs. Someone needs to wear the badge there." He adjusted his gun belt, the familiar weight of it no longer feeling like betrayal. "The stage leaves at noon, if you want to ride to Phoenix." As they walked back toward the house, Mason felt lighter than he had in years. The pain wasn't gone. It never would be. But alongside it now was something he'd thought he'd lost forever: purpose. And that's the story of Mason Hudson, folks. A man who found his way back to justice after 5 years in the wilderness. Some say the real test of a man isn't how he handles victory, but how he rises after defeat. Mason lost everything a man could lose, yet when the moment called, he found the strength to stand tall once more. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between justice and vengeance in your own life? Maybe not with six-shooters and badges, but we all face those crossroads from time to time. Would you have pulled that trigger, or would you have chosen the harder path like Mason did? If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want to ride alongside Sheriff Hudson in his next adventure as he returns to Silver Springs, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. I'm recording these tales from my cabin outside of Prescott, Arizona, where it's just past sundown and the coyotes are starting to call. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your neck of the woods. Next week, we'll head to the goldfields of Colorado, where a former Union Army colonel finds himself defending a Chinese mining camp against claim jumpers who've bought themselves a corrupt judge. It's a story about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Until then, this is Jack Morgan reminding you that the spirit of the West lives on in all of us who believe in justice, courage, and doing what's right, no matter the cost. See you on the trail, partners.